Have you ever slept beside someone for decades without truly knowing them? I have, and what I discovered broke my heart into 100 pieces. Good morning, my dears. I'm Eleanor, I'm 82 years old, and today I'm going to share with you a story I've kept in my heart for a very long time. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you watching to give this video a like, subscribe to the Grandma Diary channel if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It always brings me joy to know my words reach so many different places. I was born in 1943, in an era when women had few choices in life. Either you married young and started a family, or you were seen as an old maid. I dreamed of a storybook love, the kind that makes your heart race. And I thought I had found that when I met Richard in 1964 at a church social. Richard had brown eyes that seemed to penetrate my soul when he looked at me. He was tall, with black hair always neatly combed, and worked as an accountant at the only bank in our small town. Everyone said he was a good catch, and for a simple girl like me, a seamstress's daughter, it seemed like a dream come true when he began to court me. Our courtship was brief, only 6 months, which wasn't unusual back then. It wasn't like today where young people date for years. In 1965, wearing a simple white dress that my mother had sewn, I said, "I do," before the altar, thinking I knew the man with whom I would share my life. The first years were like a fairy tale to me. We bought a modest but cozy little house. The walls were thin, and sometimes the roof would leak when it rained hard, but it was our home. In 1967, our first child, Robert, was born, and 2 years later, our daughter, Mary. We were what they called the perfect family by the standards of that time. Richard was respected in the community. On Sundays, we went to church together. Afterward, we would have lunch at my mother-in-law's house, who always made a point of commenting on how her son had made a good choice. I washed, ironed, cooked, cared for the children, all to be the wife I thought he deserved. It was around 1970, after 5 years of marriage, that I began to notice something strange. Every night, when we lay down to sleep, Richard did something that, at first, I found merely peculiar. He counted slowly to 100. It wasn't a whisper, nor was it loud enough to disturb, but it was constant and methodical. 1, 2, 3, until he reached 100. The first few times, I asked curiously, "Richard, why do you count to 100 every night?" He would smile that sideways smile that had won me over years before, and answer, "It's just a habit to calm my thoughts, Ellie. Nothing to worry about." And like an obedient wife of the 70s, I didn't question further. I accepted his words as absolute truth. Today, I wonder how many of us women of that generation silenced our doubts in the name of family harmony. Over time, other signs began to appear. First, they were small things. Different perfume on his shirt, a lipstick stain on his collar that certainly wasn't my shade. Work hours that kept getting longer. Then came the elaborate excuses for business dinners on weeknights and sudden trips that the bank required. I remember a specific night in July of 1972. It was bitterly cold, and Richard called saying he would have to sleep in the neighboring town because there was an important audit the next day. I believed him, of course. That night, with the children already asleep, I sat in the empty living room, wrapped in a blanket, and for some reason, I found myself counting to 100, just as he did. When I reached the number 43, the phone rang. My heart raced, thinking it might be him. But when I answered, the line was silent for a few seconds until I heard a woman's laughter in the background before they hung up. That night, I couldn't sleep. Sitting by the window, watching the pale moon illuminate our modest backyard, I wondered how many nights like that were still to come. But the most painful part wasn't the suspicions. It was the fear of confronting them. What would a woman with 2 small children, no professional training, do alone in that world? Where would we live? How would I feed my children? So like many women of my generation, I chose silence. I chose to pretend I didn't see the signs, that I didn't hear the whispers at the grocery store when I passed by, that I didn't notice the pitying looks from neighbors. And every night, Beside him in bed, I heard his methodical counting to 100, imagining that each number represented a lie he told me. The children grew up. Robert, so similar to his father in gestures and way of speaking, began to question why his father was rarely at his school football games. Mary, my sweet girl, would always run to the window at the sound of any car, hoping it was her father coming home. Many times, I found her asleep on the couch, still in her dress and shoes, because she wanted to show her father her report card with excellent grades. In 1974, I started sewing for others, as my mother had done, to have some money of my own. Not that Richard didn't provide financially. He was always generous in that regard. But something inside me needed that independence, small as it was. Each dress I sewed, each curtain I adjusted for the neighbors, was a small act of autonomy. And so the days turned into months, the months into years, and that nightly counting became the soundtrack to our life of appearances. I wondered if I would ever have the courage to confront him, to demand the truth, or if I would spend the rest of my life silently counting lies with him until we reached 100. What I didn't know was that the truth would come to me in a way I could never have imagined. And when it arrived, on a rainy Tuesday in May of 1975, no counting in the world could have prepared me for the impact. It was an afternoon like any other. The children were at school. I had just finished ironing a dress for Mrs. Jenkins when the phone rang. I answered, expecting it to be a customer wanting an alteration to a garment. But on the other end of the line, a female voice I had never heard before said something that forever changed my life. "Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Regina. I think you have the right to know that your husband and I have been having an affair for over 2 years, and I'm not the only one." I was paralyzed by that call, the receiver weighing in my hand as if made of lead. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process what I had just heard. Regina. A name I had never heard before, but would now be impossible to forget. "Are you there?" asked the voice from the other end, showing no emotion. "I am," I responded, with a voice that didn't sound like my own. "Why? Why are you calling me?" "Because I'm tired of being the other woman. He promised to leave you over a year ago. He said he was just waiting for the right moment, that he needed to prepare the children. But yesterday I discovered there are others besides me. I'm not the only mistress, ma'am. Your husband has a special talent for lying." Each of her words was like a needle, piercing my already fragile heart, weakened by the suspicions I had tried to ignore for years. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye, my legs giving way as I slid to the kitchen floor. That yellow tiled floor that I waxed every week until it shone was now witness to my complete humiliation. I sat there on the cold floor. For how long? Half an hour? 2 hours? I lost track. I only know that when the living room clock struck 4, I automatically stood up. The children would be home from school soon, and no child of mine would see their mother defeated on the kitchen floor. I washed my face, fixed my hair, and prepared their snack as if it were any ordinary day, as if my world hadn't just collapsed. That evening, I served dinner as usual. Robert told about a goal he scored in physical education. Mary complained about her math teacher. Richard arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, kissed my forehead, those lips that had kissed others, and sat at the head of the table like the respectable patriarch everyone thought he was. I observed his every move, the way he cut his meat, how he smiled at the children, how he asked about their day with apparent interest. I looked for signs, something that would explain how I could live with this man for 10 years without really knowing him. But there was nothing visible, no external mark that would betray the rot that I now knew existed within him. After the children went to bed, I sat in the living room while he read the newspaper, as on so many other nights. But this was not just any night. "Who is Regina?" I asked, my voice surprisingly firm. The newspaper lowered slowly. His eyes, those same brown eyes that had won me over a decade before, now seemed like those of a stranger when they met mine. For a second, I saw panic in them. Then the mask of composure returned to its place. "I don't know any Regina," he replied, trying to appear confused. "She called me this afternoon." Silence. A silence so dense it could be cut with a knife. I saw his throat move as he swallowed hard. Ellie, whoever called must be confusing things. Probably some kind of prank. So that's how it would be. More lies. One more for the nightly count. She said you've been together for over 2 years, Richard, and that she's not the only one. He stood up, threw the newspaper on the coffee table, and began pacing the room, running his hands through his hair repeatedly. That nervous gesture that I knew so well was what he did when he was cornered. This is absurd. You're going to believe some random stranger who calls our house? I'll believe the different perfumes I've smelled on your shirts for years, the lipstick stains that aren't my shade, the silent phone calls, the sudden trips, your distance, your counting every night. When I mentioned the counting, he stopped pacing. His shoulders fell as if an invisible weight had been placed on them. What does the counting have to do with this? I don't know. You tell me, Richard, what it means to count to 100 every night before sleeping beside your wife. He sat down again, this time in the armchair across from me. He suddenly looked much older, the lines around his eyes deeper. Ellie, He began and stopped as if the words were stuck in his throat. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted to hurt you. The confession came gradually, like a wound being slowly opened. First Regina, a secretary at another bank with whom he began meeting during work trips. Then Susan, a client. Next, Marcia, a colleague's wife, and others whose names he couldn't even remember clearly. Brief affairs, one-night adventures, meetings in motels off the highway. Each revelation was a new blow. Sitting there, listening to the extent of his betrayal, I felt as if I were outside my body, watching a scene from a sad movie. This couldn't be my life. This couldn't be the man with whom I had built a family. This couldn't be the father of my children, confessing to having lived a double life for almost our entire marriage. And the counting? I asked when he finally stopped talking. Why count to 100? He lowered his eyes, unable to face me. It started as a method to fall asleep, but then it became something else. His voice was almost a whisper. Each number was an excuse, Ellie. A justification I created for myself, a lie to make me able to sleep beside you without feeling the weight of guilt. 100 excuses, 100 lies, 100 betrayals. Each night, while I believed he was just calming his thoughts, he was actually cataloging his infidelities, organizing them in his mind, stacking them in numbers so that he could fall asleep with a clear conscience, or as clear as possible for a man like him. When he finished speaking, a heavy silence settled between us. What do you say after discovering that your entire life was built on a farce, that promises made before an altar, before God, meant nothing? That while you washed his clothes, cared for his children, kept the house in order, he was in the arms of other women? I want you to leave, I finally said, my voice almost unrecognizable even to myself. Ellie, please, can we talk about this? Can we try to fix things? Get out, Richard. Go to your mother's house, or to one of those women's, or to a hotel. I don't care, but I don't want to look at you right now. He tried to argue, but something in my eyes must have convinced him of the futility of his words at that moment. He took some clothes, his toothbrush, and walked out the front door without looking back. I heard the car engine starting, the tires on the dirt road, and then silence. A silence different from any I had ever experienced. The days that followed were foggy. I had to explain to the children that their father was away on business for a few days. Robert, now 8 years old, looked at me suspiciously, as if he could sense that something bigger was happening. Mary, at 6, simply asked when he would return. Soon, I replied, not knowing if it was true. The nights were the worst. Lying alone in the bed we had shared for a decade, I found myself counting to 100, trying to understand how that ritual, so innocent in appearance, could hide something so dark. On some nights, I couldn't get past number 20 without tears coming. On others, I reached 100 and kept counting, as if I could find some answer, some meaning in numbers beyond that. A week after Richard left home, Regina called again. This time, her voice sounded different. There was no more that calculated coldness. "He came looking for me," she said. "He told me you kicked him out, that he was honest with you, that he confessed everything." "And why are you calling to tell me this?" I asked, too exhausted to feel anger. "Because I think you should know that he's trying to manipulate us both. He told me he's going to divorce you, that now it's definite. But last night I saw him with another woman in a bar, one I had never seen before." Curiously, this new revelation didn't hurt me as it should have. It was just another confirmation of who Richard really was. A man I never truly knew, despite having slept beside him for 3,650 nights. A stranger with whom I had raised 2 children. I thanked Regina for the call without resentment. In some way, she had freed me. Her words had torn away the veil of illusion under which I had been living. And as painful as it was to face the truth, it was better than continuing to live a lie. In the weeks that followed, I had to make decisions I never imagined having to face. Without formal education, with 2 young children, what would I do with my life? Going back to my parents' house wasn't an option. My father had passed away years before, and my mother lived in a small room at the back of my sister's house, who already had her own large family. It was then that I found strength inside me that I didn't know I possessed. I began to sow more, transforming what was just a supplement to our income into my livelihood. I woke up at 5 a.m. to prepare everything for the children. Then I sewed until late at night. My fingers became calloused, my back ached, but each finished dress, each completed set, was a small triumph. Richard returned after a month, asking to talk. He looked haggard, thinner, with deep circles under his eyes. I let him in more for the sake of the children, who missed him, than for any other reason. "I've made terrible mistakes, Ellie. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try to fix things for our family." I looked at him, this man I knew so well and at the same time didn't know at all, and for the first time since everything began, I felt something beyond pain and anger. I felt pity. "It's too late for some things, Richard. Trust is like a mirror. When it breaks, you can glue the pieces back together, but you'll always see the cracks in the reflection." After that conversation, Richard and I did what many couples of our generation did. We opted to continue, not out of love or true forgiveness, but out of convenience, for the children, for what others would say. It was 1975, and divorce, although it existed as a legal possibility, was still seen as a stain on one's reputation, especially for the woman. So, Richard returned home. The children were happy, of course. Robert celebrated with an enthusiasm that broke my heart. And Mary didn't leave her father's side for days, as if afraid he might disappear again. As for me, I allowed him to occupy the guest room, a small space at the back of the house that we had previously used to store old suitcases and memories we didn't want to throw away, but also didn't wish to see every day. Ironic how that perfectly described the state of our marriage. Our life transformed into a carefully rehearsed choreography. At the children's birthday parties, at Sunday lunches at my mother-in-law's house, at school events, we were the Thompsons, smiling in photographs, exchanging superficial pleasantries, keeping up appearances. But within the 4 walls of our house, we were 2 strangers, sharing a space, connected only by the children we had created. Richard continued to be a good financial provider. I cannot deny that. Over time, he was promoted to bank manager, which meant more money, but also more travel. I didn't question where he went, who he was with. I had learned that some questions only bring answers that hurt more than doubt. I continued sewing, no longer out of necessity, but because those hours bent over fabrics, creating something with my own hands, became my refuge, my small measure of control in a world that had proven to be so unpredictable. The nights were silent now. There was no more counting to 100 coming from the room next door. And I found myself missing that absence. Sometimes before sleeping, I would count myself, like a ritual to measure the emptiness that had settled in my life. 1, 2, 3, until reaching 100, each number representing a day I had survived, a small victory in the silent war I waged against my own bitterness. The 80s arrived, bringing changes with them. Robert, now a teenager, began to question the strange dynamic between his parents. "Why don't you sleep in the same room like my friend's parents?" he asked once during dinner. Richard choked on his wine. I said something about snoring and insomnia, a small lie to protect a truth too big for a 13-year-old boy to understand. Mary, always more sensitive, rarely asked direct questions. But I noticed how her eyes observed each interaction between me and Richard, as if looking for clues to a mystery she sensed existed but couldn't name. At 11 years old, she already demonstrated that keen intuition that the women in our family seemed to inherit, passing from mother to daughter like a sixth sense to detect silenced pain. In 1982, my mother passed away after a pneumonia that quickly worsened. I remember being at the funeral, receiving condolences from people I barely knew, when I saw Richard on the other side of the room talking to a woman I had never seen before. She was young, perhaps 10 years younger than him, and there was something in the way she tilted her head when he spoke, how she lightly touched his arm while laughing at something he said. I recognized those gestures. They were the same ones I made almost 20 years ago when we met at the church social. I said nothing, neither that day nor in the days that followed. What would be the point? Time had taught me that words don't change people's nature. Richard was who he was, a man incapable of being faithful, not out of calculated malice, but due to a weakness of character that I had accepted as part of the package when I decided to continue our marriage. The children grew up as children do. Robert finished high school in 1985 and got a scholarship to study engineering in Boston. It was the first time I saw Richard cry since we met, when we left our son at the bus station, holding an old suitcase and dreams too big for our small town. At that moment, we shared something genuine, a love for our children that surpassed all the flaws in our relationship. Mary chose to stay closer, studying education at the college in the neighboring town. She came home every weekend, bringing books, stories, and a worldview that made me realize how much the world had changed since my youth. "Mom, you didn't have to put up with all of this," she said to me one night, while helping me organize scraps for a patchwork quilt. I didn't ask what she meant. I knew that she knew, just as I knew about Richard. Some truths don't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. In 1988, our town was hit by a historic flood. The water rose quickly, flooding homes, destroying crops, washing away decades of memories in a matter of hours. Our house, being on higher ground, was spared the worst, but we spent weeks helping neighbors rebuild what they had lost. It was during this period that I noticed the first significant change in Richard. He seemed more present, more engaged. He would wake up before sunrise to coordinate rescue teams, spend entire days carrying waterlogged furniture, distributing food, comforting families who had lost everything. At night, he would return exhausted, covered in mud, but with a gleam in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. The gleam of someone who had found a purpose. "Ellie," he said to me one night as we shared a coffee on the porch, watching the moon illuminate the debris that the water had left. "I think I've spent my whole life looking in the wrong place." I didn't ask what he meant. Part of me didn't want to know. Another part already knew. The 90s brought more transformations. Mary married a teacher she met in college, a kind young man named Paul, who looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he had spent his entire life trying to formulate. The wedding was simple, in the garden of the parish house. Richard walked her down the aisle, and as he gave her to the groom, he whispered something in her ear that made her smile and cry at the same time. I never knew what it was, and I never asked. Robert returned from Boston transformed, with long hair, new ideas, a Japanese girlfriend named Yumi, who spoke English with an adorable accent, and announced that he had received an offer to work at a multinational in Chicago. We had a farewell party, and when I hugged him before he left, I realized that my boy had become a man I barely knew, but of whom I was deeply proud. With the children following their paths, Richard and I found ourselves alone again, as in the beginning, but so different from those young people full of dreams. He was calmer, more homely. The trips decreased, the nights out ended. He began to tend a small garden behind the house, cultivating orchids with a patience I never imagined he possessed. Sometimes I would catch myself observing him as he concentrated on a particularly delicate plant. His fingers, now with age spots, moving with surprising precision. In these moments, I felt a confusion of emotions, resentment for the lost years, anger for the betrayals, but also a strange peace for having made it this far, somehow surviving the shipwreck of our marriage. It was in 1998, when we were already in our 50s, that life decided to play another trick on us. Richard began to lose weight rapidly, his skin acquiring a yellowish tone that could not be ignored. After weeks of insisting, I finally got him to see a doctor. The diagnosis came like a blow: liver cancer in an advanced stage. "How long?" I asked the doctor, a young man who seemed to be the age of our Robert, while Richard waited in the car, refusing to hear details of his own prognosis. 6 months, maybe a year with aggressive treatment, but the quality of life? He left the sentence hanging in the air, his look saying what words couldn't. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers turned white. Beside me, Richard looked out the window, observing our small town pass by, as if trying to memorize every detail. "I don't want treatment," he said when we stopped in front of our house. "I don't want to spend my last months in hospitals hooked up to machines." I wanted to protest, to say he needed to fight for the children, for the grandchildren who would come, but looking at his face, I saw a determination that I had rarely witnessed before. And I understood that, perhaps for the first time in his life, he was making a completely honest choice. The following weeks were a succession of phone calls, visits, arrangements. Robert insisted we should look for specialists in New York. He talked about experimental treatments, about not giving up. Mary, pregnant with her first child, came every day after the school where she taught, bringing homemade soups that Richard could barely taste, but pretended to enjoy so as not to hurt her feelings. It was during this period that I found the diary. I was cleaning the office, looking for insurance documents, when I opened a drawer we rarely used. There, hidden under piles of old papers, was a black-covered notebook with no identification. I opened it hesitantly, not wanting to invade Richard's privacy, but driven by a curiosity I couldn't control. The first pages dated from 1972. The handwriting was unmistakably his, but the words didn't seem to come from the man I knew. Today, I counted to 100 again. Number 37, "It's just harmless fun." Number 58, "Ellie will never know." Number 72, "It doesn't mean anything." Number 100, "Tomorrow I'll stop this." The same lie I tell myself every night. I leafed through the diary with trembling fingers, years and years of similar entries, confessions, regrets, broken promises. And then, from 1988, the year of the flood, a gradual change in tone. Fewer justifications, more reflections, fewer names of women, more thoughts about the meaning of life, about lost time, about remorse. The last entry was from just 2 weeks ago, written in a hand already affected by weakness. Today I counted to 100 again, but each number was a reason why I don't deserve her forgiveness. I closed the diary and put it back where I had found it. That night, I prepared a light dinner that I knew he could eat: vegetable broth, soft bread, a homemade pudding that had always been his favorite. We sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the garden of orchids, which now bloomed in colors too vibrant for a place where death cast its shadow. "I found your diary today," I said, after a long silence. He didn't seem surprised or ashamed. He just nodded slightly, as if he had been expecting this moment to come. "I always knew that one day you would find it. Perhaps part of me wanted you to find it." Why did you write all that down?" He placed his spoon beside his nearly untouched plate and looked directly at me, his eyes, those same brown eyes that had won me over decades before, now hollowed by illness, but clearer and more honest than they had ever been. Because I needed to admit to myself who I was, and because somehow I hoped that one day I could be better than that. It was the most sincere answer I had ever received from him. The weeks following the discovery of the diary passed in a strange peace. It's curious how imminent death has the power to dissipate fogs that we spent decades building around truths we prefer not to see. Richard and I established a silent routine, but no longer that heavy silence loaded with unspoken grievances. It was a lighter silence, almost contemplative. In October of 1998, the disease advanced rapidly. The doctor had predicted 6 months, but Richard's body seemed to have its own plans. The pain medications became insufficient. His legs swelled so much that he could barely walk to the orchid garden he loved so much. Robert returned from Chicago, taking an indefinite leave from work. Mary, despite her advanced pregnancy, appeared every day, sitting beside her father's bed to read books aloud, the same ones he used to read to her as a child. One particularly difficult night, as I helped Richard settle after a coughing fit that left him exhausted, he held my wrist with surprising strength for someone so debilitated. "Ellie, I need to tell you something before it's too late." I sat on the edge of the bed, adjusting the pillow so he could speak without so much effort. His eyes, once so alive, were now clouded by medication, but still maintained that intensity that always disconcerted me. "I'm listening," I said, holding his wrinkled hand between mine. "The counting began much earlier than you imagine." He paused, seeking breath. I waited patiently, feeling the fragility of his fingers, the bones almost visible beneath the yellowed skin. "My father, do you remember him?" How could I forget? Old Mr. Thompson was known in town for 2 reasons: his talent as a carpenter and his explosive temper when he drank. Richard rarely spoke of him, even after he died of a heart attack in 1970. "I do remember. I grew up watching him destroy our house when he drank. I saw how he treated my mother, the shouting, the broken objects, the bruises she tried to hide." I felt a chill. In over 30 years together, Richard had never shared these details. I knew his childhood hadn't been easy, but he kept this chapter of his life hermetically sealed. I swore I would be different, that I would never be like him. His voice faltered. "But you know what I discovered on the day of our wedding? When I saw you walking down the aisle, so young, so confident in me?" I shook my head, unable to speak. "I discovered that I carried the same anger inside me, the same fire. I felt it for the first time when you burned my favorite shirt with the iron. A disproportionate fury consumed me from within. My fists closed instinctively. I remembered that day, shortly after the wedding. I was devastated for having ruined the shirt he liked so much. He went out for a walk and came back hours later, calm, saying it didn't matter. I never imagined what was going on behind those brown eyes. That's when it began, Ellie. The counting. 1, 2, 3, until I felt the anger dissipate. It worked that day, and on subsequent days when something irritated me. It was my method to not explode, to not transform into my father. I felt tears running down my face. So many years sharing a life, and only now, at the gates of death, was he revealing this silent battle he waged with himself. But then, the other women, he sighed, the sound wheezing in his compromised lungs. That came later. When I realized I needed the counting to not take out my frustrations on you, I began to feel weak, flawed, and I looked for validation in other women, confirmation that I still had some value. It was wrong, I knew. Each adventure only increased my guilt, my self-contempt, and the cycle continued. The more I hated myself, the more I sought these distractions, and the more I needed to count at night to bear what I had become. We remained silent for a few minutes, only the sound of his labored breathing filling the room. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light through the window, forming dancing patterns on the white sheet. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Ellie. I know I ruined your life, that I wasted the chance to have a true marriage with the only woman who really mattered. I just wanted you to know that the counting, in the beginning, was my fight to be a better man than my father. Why didn't you tell me? We could have faced this together." His gaze was lost on some distant point, beyond the window, beyond perhaps time itself. Because I was ashamed of needing that control, that childish ritual of carrying this anger that I so despised in my father. And later, when I began to cheat, well, by then it was too late. That night, after he finally fell asleep, I sat on the porch, looking at the stars. I thought about how life is built of layers upon layers of secrets. Some we keep from others, some we keep from ourselves. How can we spend decades beside someone and still not know the battles they fight in the silence of their minds? The next day, when I woke up, Richard was sitting up in bed, unusually alert, asking to go to the garden. Robert helped him, practically carrying his father to the chair we had placed among the orchids. There he stayed for hours, delicately touching the colorful petals, breathing in the perfume that the gentle breeze brought. "I should have planted flowers much earlier," he commented when I brought tea for both of them. "I spent years believing I didn't deserve beautiful things." It was the last time Richard visited his garden. In the weeks that followed, his decline was rapid. He could barely swallow even the thinnest liquids. His skin acquired a frightening pallor except for the deep yellow around his eyes. Morphine kept him in a state of semi-consciousness most of the time, but occasionally he had moments of crystal clarity. It was in one of these moments, in a November dawn, that I heard his weak voice calling me. I was sleeping in an armchair beside the hospital bed we had installed in the living room. The bedroom was on the second floor, and he could no longer climb the stairs. "Ellie, are you awake?" "I'm here," I replied, turning on the lamp. The soft light revealed his emaciated face, his sunken eyes, but strangely bright. "Can you help me count?" Confused, I moved closer, holding his hand. "Count what, Richard?" "To 100 one last time." I understood then what he wanted. It was no longer a ritual of guilt or control, but a last shared act, a closure. We began together. 1, our voices joining in the silence of dawn. 2, his voice almost a whisper. 3, tears running down my face. We continued, number after number, decade after decade of our life together, condensed in that simple sequence. When we reached 64, his voice failed. I continued alone. Each number a prayer, a farewell, 98, 99, 100. When I finished, I looked at his face. A soft smile had formed on his lips. His eyes were closed. His hand, still in mine, had lost tension. Richard departed that night in peace, like someone who finally completes a long and difficult journey. The funeral was simple, but surprisingly well attended. I discovered that my husband, in his later years, had touched more lives than I imagined. Former bank clients whom he had helped in difficult times, neighbors he had rescued during the flood, young people he had mentored. Everyone had a story about Mr. Thompson. Stories that revealed a man I was only beginning to know when I lost him. Mary gave birth to a girl 3 weeks later. She named her Rochelle in honor of her father. When I put that little bundle in my arms for the first time, looking at the red face that already showed traces of her grandfather, I felt a strange sense of continuity, as if life was giving us another chance through this new generation. It was while putting away Richard's belongings, a few weeks after his passing, that I made the last discovery. At the bottom of the wardrobe, among boxes of old shoes, I found a yellowed envelope addressed to me. Inside, a notebook different from the diary I already knew. This one was older, the cover worn, the pages yellowed by time. On the first pages, a list written in Richard's young handwriting. Reasons not to be like my father. 1, the look of terror in my mother's eyes. 2, the nights I slept under the bed to hide. 3, the broken promises. The list continued, page after page, reaching exactly the number 100. On the last page, a more recent entry, written with the trembling hand of his final days. Today I see that I failed in many of my promises. I wasn't the man I swore to be. I hurt the only person who truly loved me, not with fists like my father, but with betrayals that perhaps wounded even more deeply. But I still believe that we can break the cycles that imprison us, even if I only partially succeeded. Perhaps my children and their children can complete what I began. Ellie, if you find this, know that in each 100 that I counted, there was a genuine hope of being better the next day. I failed many times, but I never stopped trying. I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest, letting the tears flow freely. They were not tears of anger or sadness, but of understanding. Understanding that we are all, to some extent, products of the patterns we inherit, fighting daily to overcome them, sometimes failing, sometimes achieving small victories that no one else sees. That night, before sleeping, I did something I hadn't done since Richard's departure. I counted to 100. But this time, each number wasn't an accusation or a lament. It was an acceptance, an acknowledgement of human complexity, of our capacity to cause pain even when we want to love, of our continuous struggle to be better than our worst instincts. And when I reached 100, I fell asleep with a lightness I hadn't felt in years, as if a weight had finally been removed, not by forgetting or completely forgiving, but by understanding more fully. The years that followed Richard's death were a period of rediscovery. It seems strange to say this at 60 years of age, but I felt as if I were learning to live again. For almost 4 decades, I was Richard's wife, first living in the illusion of a happy marriage, then enduring the bitter truth of betrayal, and finally existing in a kind of silent truce. Now, for the first time since I was 19, I was just Eleanor. The house suddenly seemed too big for one person. The echoes of footsteps in the hallway, the silence during meals, the absence of small noises that I barely noticed before. All of this created a void that, surprisingly, was not only painful, but also liberating. I began to talk to myself, to sing while cooking, to leave the radio on all day. Small rebellions I never allowed myself in Richard's presence. In 1999, close to the first anniversary of his death, Robert visited me with a proposal that would change my course. "Mom, the house where I grew up in Virginia sits empty most of the time since I moved to Chicago. Why don't you sell this house and come live there? You'd be closer to Mary and little Rochelle." The idea of leaving the house where I had lived for over 30 years, where I had raised my children, where I had faced my greatest sorrows and small joys, should have been frightening. But contrary to what I expected, I felt a wave of enthusiasm, a change, a fresh start. I sold the house in a few months. The last day was emotionally complex. I walked through each room, saying goodbye not just to the physical space, but to versions of myself that had inhabited those walls. The young bride full of dreams, the dedicated mother, the betrayed wife, the resigned woman, and finally the widow, in search of a new meaning. In the garden, I gathered the last orchids that Richard had planted. Some of them would come with me, a reminder that even from the most painful experiences, unexpected beauties can bloom. The house in Virginia was smaller, but infinitely more welcoming. A typical wooden construction with large windows that let in sunlight throughout the day. The backyard opened onto a small creek, where the sound of running water created a constant and comforting soundtrack. Mary lived just 20 minutes away, and little Rochelle, who was already crawling, became my frequent companion. Watching her discover the world with that genuine astonishment that only children possess rekindled in me a curiosity that had been dormant for decades. It was in 2000, at the turn of the millennium, that I began my own counting. Not to 100 as Richard did, but beyond, far beyond. Each number represented not a guilt or an excuse, but a possibility, a small achievement, a reason to continue. Number 1 was when I drove alone for 2 hours to Washington, D.C. to attend a classical music concert, something I had always wanted to do but never had the courage for. Number 2 was when I learned to swim at 62, overcoming the fear of water that had accompanied me since childhood. Number 3 was planting my own garden, not just with orchids but with a variety of flowers and herbs that transformed the backyard into a small multicolored paradise. And so I continued, accumulating numbers, experiences, small victories. I traveled alone for the first time in 2003 to visit Niagara Falls, something I had always wanted to do. I remember sitting in a cafe, watching the mist rise from the falls, when I realized I was genuinely happy. Not that anxious happiness of youth, always aiming for the future, but a quiet joy of being exactly where I should be, exactly as I should be. In 2005, Robert married Yumi in a ceremony that blended American and Japanese traditions. Her family came from Tokyo, bringing elaborate kimonos and a respect for elders that deeply moved me. During the party, Yumi's mother, who spoke very little English, sat beside me, and, with gestures and smiles, we managed to establish a communication that transcended linguistic barriers. Two women from such distinct cultures, united by love for their children and by the shared experience of building a life around that love. The following year, Mary had her second child, Gabriel. Unlike his sister, who had the marked features of the Thompsons, the boy was the image of Paul. Green eyes, light hair, calm temperament. Seeing my daughter building her own family, making her own mistakes and successes, made me reflect on the legacy we pass from generation to generation, not always intentionally. One afternoon, while observing Mary patiently deal with a tantrum from little Rochelle, now 7 years old, I wondered if she was repeating patterns of mine, just as I certainly repeated patterns from my mother. The idea that our lives are partly echoes of previous lives, not in the mystical sense, but in the sense of human continuity, began to fascinate me. I initiated a project I never imagined undertaking, writing the history of our family. Not just names and dates on a family tree, but real stories with all their imperfections and beauties. I interviewed elderly aunts, distant cousins, old family friends. Each conversation was like opening a long-closed drawer, revealing forgotten treasures. Some precious gems, others broken objects, but all essential parts of the mosaic that formed our collective identity. It was during this project that I discovered family secrets that explained much about Richard's father and his propensity for violence. A cycle of abuse that dated back generations. It didn't justify his actions, but it offered a context that made everything more humanly comprehensible. I also discovered stories of resistance and overcoming among the women in my own family. Great-grandmothers who defied conventions, grandmothers who survived unimaginable losses, aunts who chose uncommon paths for their times. In 2010, at 72 years old, I received an invitation I never expected, to give a lecture at the college where Mary now taught about memory and oral history. The idea of speaking in public to a room full of young university students initially terrified me. What formal knowledge did I have to share? My education had ended at the equivalent of high school, and my life had been largely dedicated to family and sewing. "That's exactly why we want to hear from you, Mom," Mary insisted. "You represent a generation of women whose stories are rarely told in academic books. Your experiences are as valid as those of any PhD." I accepted, trembling with insecurity, but determined to face this challenge as well. Number 78 in my personal counting. On the day of the lecture, I looked at those curious young faces and began by telling about Richard's counting. I didn't mention the betrayals or the most intimate details, but I spoke about how rituals can be both prisons and lifelines, about how we carry intergenerational patterns, often without realizing it, about how understanding can be a path to liberation, without necessarily going through complete forgiveness. The response was overwhelming. Students came to hug me after the lecture, many with tears in their eyes, sharing fragments of their own family histories. Young women thanked me for giving voice to experiences that their grandmothers and mothers had lived in silence. I realized that my story, seemingly common, resonated deeply because it reflected universal patterns of human relationships that transcend generations. That lecture generated others, and soon I found myself visiting community centers, senior groups, and even a conference on women and memory in Richmond. The shy girl from a small town, who had dreamed only of a happy marriage, now traveled across the state, sharing reflections on life, loss, and new beginnings. In 2015, Robert and Yumi gave me my third grandchild, Thomas Richard, a name that honored both his Japanese and American heritage. When I held him for the first time, I imagined what Richard would think of that small being who carried his name and part of his genes, but who would grow up in a world so different, with possibilities we never dreamed of in our youth. That night, I added a new number to my counting, 89, witnessing the continuity of life through generations. The more I advanced in my counting, the more I realized that it was becoming not just a list of personal achievements, but a record of gratitude. Gratitude even for the pains, for without them, I would not have become the woman I now was. In 2020, when the pandemic isolated the world, I found myself confined at home at 82 years old, considered a high-risk group. Mary, concerned, insisted that I move temporarily to her house, but I chose to stay in my own space. "Mom, at least learn to use the internet so we can do video calls," she begged, leaving a tablet on my porch with detailed instructions. That's how, at the height of a global crisis, I added number 98 to my list, learning technology at 82 years old. To my surprise, I adapted quickly. Soon I was not only talking with my children and grandchildren, but participating in online storyteller groups, watching virtual concerts, and even giving remote interviews to students researching oral history. One of these interviews was for a young man who created content for the internet, something called a podcast, which I barely understood. He asked me to tell about Richard's ritual, the counting to 100, without going into intimate details. I hesitated initially. That story belonged to us both. It was too personal. But then I realized that sharing it, even partially, could help other people understand their own patterns, their own silent rituals. The interview became an unexpected success. I received messages from people all over the United States. Husbands confessing their own control mechanisms, wives recognizing patterns in their relationships, young people thanking me for having a more complex view of their parents' and grandparents' relationships. One of these young people was a video maker who asked permission to transform my story into a video for his online platform. "It would just be the story of the counting, Mrs. Thompson. I think it can help many people understand that we all carry invisible struggles." I accepted on the condition that my face wouldn't appear. I wanted the story to be the focus, not me. A few weeks later, he sent me the link to the video titled, "My husband counted to 100 every night before sleeping until the day I understood why." And so I reached number 100 of my own counting. Seeing our story, with all its complexities, imperfections, and humanity, touching hearts I will never personally know. But unlike Richard, I didn't stop at 100. I continue counting day after day, adding new numbers, new experiences, new understandings, because I've learned that life is not a countdown to an end, but a constant sum of moments that transform us, challenge us, and eventually free us from patterns we judged inevitable. Today, at 82 years old, sitting in this chair as I record this video for you, I realize that sharing this story is number 101 in my counting. And I wonder, as I look at you who are watching me now, what is your silent ritual? What do you count when no one is listening? And more importantly, when will you start your own counting? Not of justifications or guilt, but of possibilities and liberations. If this story touched your heart in any way, please leave your like, subscribe to the Grandma Diary channel, and tell me in the comments when you began your own counting. I'm eager to know a little of your story too.